Kentucky in October looks like someone forgot to finish the painting. The hills roll on, amber and rust, and the deep brown of turned earth, and somewhere in the middle of all that color, at the end of a gravel road nobody uses anymore, there is a farm that looks like it has been waiting a very long time for something. Wide shot. The land first. 40 acres of it flat and quiet under a pale sky. Then the farmhouse at the end of the driveway, 2 stories, paint gone, porch sagging on the left side like a man who has been standing too long, and behind it the barn, red once, gray now, a padlock on the door rusted solid. Closer, the padlock, the rust, the way it catches the afternoon light like something that has kept a secret for so long, it has forgotten what the secret was. A boy stands at the end of the driveway, 16 years old, 1 duffel bag, a golden retriever beside him. He has $47 in his pocket. He has nowhere else to go. He looks at the barn. The barn does not look back, but something underneath it does. Part 1. What they left him. The morning of the funeral, Lucas Hale wore the only dress shirt he owned. It was his great-grandfather's, too wide in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves. He'd rolled the cuffs twice and still looked like a boy playing dress-up in a dead man's clothes, which he supposed was exactly what he was. Copper sat beside him in the church pew. Nobody said anything about the dog. Nobody had the nerve. The golden retriever was 2 years old and 70 pounds of warm gold fur, and he leaned his whole weight against Lucas's leg like he understood exactly what was happening. Maybe he did. Dogs know things people don't say out loud. The church smelled like old wood and lilies, white lilies everywhere. Ruth Hale had requested them specifically, according to Uncle Garth, who had apparently taken charge of every single detail of a funeral that wasn't his to manage. Garth stood near the entrance in a dark suit that fit perfectly, shaking hands, accepting condolences, nodding with that particular expression men wear when they want to appear grief-stricken but are actually thinking about something else entirely. Lucas watched him. Garth was 52, salt and pepper hair, the kind of handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He ran a real estate consulting firm out of Lexington and drove a truck that cost more than most people's houses. He'd visited Ruth maybe 4 times in the last 2 years. 4 times. Lucas had been there every weekend. Copper pressed harder against his leg. Ruth Hale had been 79 years old. She'd raised 3 children on a Kentucky tobacco farm, outlived her husband Henry by 45 years, and spent the last decade of her life in a house full of too many rooms and not enough people. Diane had been her youngest. Diane, who used to drive Lucas the 3 hours from Columbus to Calder every Friday after school. Diane, who would sit on Ruth's porch and drink sweet tea and talk until the fireflies came out. Diane, who had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago when Lucas was 13. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. After that, Lucas started making the drive himself. Bus to Lexington, pickup truck with Walt from the hardware store, sometimes hitchhiking the last stretch when he had to. Ruth never asked how he got there. She just opened the door and said, "You're late," and handed him whatever she'd been cooking. He'd been there the weekend before she died. She'd seemed fine, or not fine exactly, but present, sharp. She'd beaten him at gin rummy 4 times in a row and accused him of letting her win. He hadn't. She was just that good. 300 people came to the funeral. Lucas knew maybe 12 of them. Garth knew all 300, or acted like he did, moving through the crowd after the service like a man running for office. Patrice, Garth's younger sister, stood in a cluster of women near the refreshment table. She'd hugged Lucas once, briefly, and then moved away. She hadn't looked at him since. That felt like information. Lucas stood by the casket for a long time after most people had filtered out. Copper stood beside him. The funeral director hovered nearby with the professional patience of someone paid to wait. Ruth looked small. She'd always seemed large to him, big presence, big opinions, hands that were always doing something, shelling beans, folding laundry, pointing at him when she wanted to make a point, which was often. "You've got Henry's stubbornness," she'd told him once. "God help whoever has to love you." He'd asked her what that meant. She just smiled and changed the subject. He touched the edge of the casket, just for a second. Then he straightened up, smoothed the borrowed shirt, and walked out into the Kentucky afternoon. Copper fell into step beside him without being told. The family meeting was 3 days later. Garth called it. Used those exact words. Family meeting, like they were going to discuss Thanksgiving plans. Lucas drove himself. He'd had his license for 4 months, and the car was a 2009 Honda Civic that had belonged to Diane and smelled like her particular brand of hand lotion if he drove with the windows up. He usually drove with the windows up. He parked in Garth's driveway in Lexington behind 2 cars he didn't recognize. Copper jumped out before he'd even set the brake, looked up at the house, looked back at Lucas. "You sure about this?" Lucas wasn't sure about anything, but he went inside. The dining room had been set up like a conference room. That was the first thing Lucas noticed. Folders on the table, a legal pad, Garth at the head, Patrice to his right. A man Lucas didn't know, introduced briefly as our estate attorney, Mr. Fowler, sat at the corner with an expression that suggested he'd had this particular meeting many times before. Lucas sat across from all of them. Copper lay down at his feet. Nobody offered them anything to drink. "Thanks for coming, Lucas," Garth said. He said it like Lucas had a choice, like he could have not come. "We need to talk about Grandma Ruth's estate, get everything sorted out properly." "Of course," Lucas said. He kept his voice even. He'd been practicing that. Garth opened a folder. Ruth had assets, obviously, the house here in Calder, the savings account, Frank's old truck, which is still in her name, the investment accounts she and Henry built up over the years. He paused. "And the farm." Lucas waited. "The farm out on County Road 7. Garth said it the way you'd say that broken chair we keep meaning to throw out. "The old property, Henry's place. It's been sitting empty for years. County sent letters about back taxes. There's outstanding debt of $11,000. The assessed value doesn't even cover what's owed." Patrice nodded slowly, like she'd rehearsed it. Garth spread the papers across the table. The house, the accounts, the truck. He explained each one with the calm efficiency of a man who'd already decided everything before anyone sat down. The house he'd had himself added to the deed 10 years ago. Estate planning, practical decision, his name, his responsibility. The accounts moved into a trust. For management purposes, he and Patrice as co-trustees. The truck, Patrice would take it. "You don't drive much, Lucas." "I drove here," Lucas said. Garth smiled, one of those smiles that didn't reach anything. "Right, but you're young. You'll have your own vehicle situation sorted out before long." Lucas looked at the table, at the papers spread across it, at the neat stacks representing everything Ruth Hale had spent 79 years building. "And the farm?" he asked. Another pause. Garth and Patrice exchanged the briefest look. "It's yours," Garth said, "if you want it." "There's nothing there," Patrice added quickly. "The house is in bad shape. There's no working water, the electric hasn't been connected in years, and the back taxes—" "You said it's mine," Lucas said. "Ruth left it to me." Garth spread his hands. It was the arrangement she'd expressed verbally before her passing. Given the outstanding debt and the condition of the property, we didn't see any need to contest it. Of course you didn't, because it was worthless, because they'd already taken everything else. Lucas sat very still. He thought about the house in Calder, where Ruth had lived, the kitchen where she'd made him biscuits from scratch every single visit, the porch where they'd sat and watched the thunderstorms roll in from the west, the bedroom where Diane had slept when she was a little girl. He thought about Garth's name on the deed. He thought about all of it. Then he said, "Okay." Garth blinked. "Okay, I'll take the farm." Nobody argued. Why would they? They had the house, the money, the truck, the accounts. They had everything that could be counted, appraised, transferred, and managed. The farm was $11,000 of debt attached to 40 acres of Kentucky clay and a barn that probably didn't have a roof anymore. It was a punchline. Let the kid have the punchline. Lucas drove back to Columbus that evening. He sat in the parking lot of a Walmart for 40 minutes before he could make himself go inside, bought 3 cans of soup, a box of crackers, a flashlight, extra batteries, a sleeping bag rated for 40 degrees. He stood in the camping aisle for a long time staring at the sleeping bags. Copper sat beside the cart watching him with that calm, golden patience. "What are we doing?" Lucas asked himself. "I have no idea," he answered. He bought the sleeping bag anyway. He packed everything he owned into one duffel bag and a backpack. It wasn't difficult. He didn't own much. Some clothes, his mother's copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that he'd read so many times the spine was white, a photograph of Diane taken at Christmas the year before she died. She was laughing at something just off camera. He'd never know what. He left the key to the apartment on the kitchen counter. He'd been renting a room from a woman named Carol who worked nights at the hospital and barely noticed when he came and went. He left 2 months' worth of saved cash for the remaining rent. It wasn't quite enough, but it was close. He took the bus from Columbus to Lexington, then another bus from Lexington to a town called Calder, Kentucky. Copper took up most of the seat beside him. Nobody complained. The flat suburbs of Ohio slowly turned into something different. Rolling hills, bare trees, red clay peeking through the grass on the hillsides. October in Kentucky looked like someone had spilled a jar of amber and just left it there. Lucas watched it out the window. He didn't sleep. The bus dropped him at a gas station on the edge of Calder. Calder wasn't much. 2-block Main Street, hardware store, a diner with a handwritten menu taped to the window, a post office that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 1970s. Lucas asked the gas station attendant for directions to the Hale farm out on County Road 7. The man looked at him for a long moment, at the duffel bag, at the golden retriever sitting at his feet, at his face. "You Henry's people?" he finally asked. "His great-grandson," Lucas said. "Sort of. His daughter's daughter was my mother." The man nodded slowly. "Road's about 4 miles east. Can't miss the turn. Old mailbox still has the name on it." He paused. "Nobody's been out there in a while, son." "I know." "Long while." "I know." Copper looked up at Lucas, then at the man, then back at Lucas. 4 miles, Copper seemed to say. "Let's go then." They walked. 4 miles on a 2-lane road with no shoulder and a duffel bag that got heavier with every step. It took almost 2 hours. A truck slowed down halfway there. Woman in her 60s feed cap window rolled down. "You headed somewhere specific, honey, or just general nowhere?" "Hale Farm," Lucas said. "County Road 7. Her eyebrows went up. "Henry's old place." "Yes, ma'am." She studied him. "The dog, the bag. You want a ride?" "I'm okay, thanks." She drove on. Copper looked at Lucas. "We could have gotten a ride." "I know," Lucas said out loud. "I needed to walk." Copper accepted this without judgment. Dogs are good like that. He smelled the farm before he saw it. Or, not the farm exactly. The particular smell of a place that's been empty for years. Old wood drying in sun, grass growing where it shouldn't. Something underneath that was rust maybe, or just time. The mailbox was still there, Hale in faded black letters on a rusted tin box that leaned at about a 30-degree angle. The driveway was barely visible through the weeds that had pushed up through the gravel. Saplings had started to take root along the edges. Lucas stood at the end of it for a long moment. Copper sat, waited. The farmhouse was at the end of the driveway, maybe 100 yards back. 2 stories, wood frame, paint peeled down to bare boards on most of the walls. One upstairs window was broken glass gone, just the frame left. The porch sagged badly on the left side where the supports had rotted through. Behind the house, the barn. It had been red once. Now it was the color of weathered bone. The roof had partially collapsed on the south end. A padlock hung on the main door, rusted solid. Lucas had been here twice as a kid, once when he was 6, once when he was 9. He remembered it being big, green fields, a tire swing behind the barn, Ruth making lemonade in the kitchen. He didn't remember it looking like this. What happens to a place when nobody loves it? This, apparently. He picked up the duffel bag, walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked, Ruth had told him once. Henry never locked the house, just the barn. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was trapped, stale in the particular way of rooms that haven't been breathed in for years. Dust on every surface, spiderwebs in the upper corners of every window. But underneath all of it, the faint ghost of a smell he recognized. Something warm, something that might have been wood smoke and old cinnamon. Ruth had been here last spring. He knew that. She'd driven herself down to check on things. She'd said, waving off his offer to come with her, "I don't need a chaperone, Lucas." He'd worried about her the whole weekend. He walked through the rooms slowly. The kitchen had dishes in the cabinets, blue flower pattern, old-fashioned, the kind of dishes nobody made anymore. The living room had an armchair positioned near the window, angled, so whoever sat in it could see the barn. There were ashes in the fireplace from Ruth's last visit, or maybe from years ago. No way to tell. He found the fuse box in the hallway, flipped the main breaker. Nothing. Tried the kitchen faucet. Dry. He stood in the kitchen and looked out at the barn through the window. The padlock on the barn door caught what was left of the afternoon light, rusted, intact. Henry had never let anyone in that barn. Ruth had mentioned it once, years ago, the way you mention something you've long since stopped thinking about. Your great-grandfather was particular about his barn. Private man. She'd said it like it was just a fact about him, like saying he was tall or liked strong coffee. Lucas had been 8 years old and hadn't thought to ask why. He thought about it now. He had $47 in his wallet, no working electricity, no water, temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night. He had a sleeping bag rated for 40 degrees, and a golden retriever, and absolutely nowhere else to be. He sat down on the kitchen floor back against the cabinet. Copper came over and settled across his feet, all 70 pounds of him, and rested his chin on Lucas's knee. "Okay," Lucas said to the empty kitchen. "Okay." The first night he slept on the floor of the bedroom with the sleeping bag and Copper stretched alongside him for warmth. He woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of wind in the trees and something skittering in the walls. Lay there for 2 hours listening, watching the darkness, thinking about his mother. Diane Hale had never talked much about this farm. Not directly. She'd bring Ruth up constantly. "Ruth said this. Ruth told me that Ruth used to make this recipe," but the farm itself was almost never mentioned. When it was, she'd say something vague. "It's just land, Lucas. It's just an old place," and then change the subject. He'd never pushed. He wished now that he had. He got up at dawn and started cleaning. It took 3 days. He swept every floor, scrubbed the bathroom with what he found under the kitchen sink, old bleach, a brush so stiff it was almost solid. He scraped mold from the tile grout with a butter knife, carried armloads of dead leaves and mouse nests and unidentifiable debris out to a burn pile behind the house. He found canned goods in the cellar. The old stuff went into a trash bag, but there were also mason jars on the lower shelves, vegetables preserved in brine, sealed tight labels in Ruth's handwriting, green beans, tomatoes, corn. He ate those. He found a gas stove that still worked once he figured out how to relight the pilot, cooked rice and beans the first evening with a can of tomatoes from the hardware store in town that he'd walked 4 miles to reach, ate at the kitchen table, looked out at the barn. On the second day, a neighbor came by. Truck pulling up, slow, window rolled down. Man about 70, white hair, Hands like a working man's hands, thick at the knuckles, steady, the kind of hands that had built things and fixed things for 50 years and knew the difference. "You living here?" the man asked. "Yes, sir." "Water's been shut off. You'll need to call the county to get it reconnected. Electric too, both going to need deposits." "How much? Couple hundred maybe?" Lucas had $47. The man looked at him for a moment. His eyes were gray and sharper than his weathered face suggested. He didn't ask any more questions, just nodded once like he'd made a decision about something and drove on. His name, Lucas would learn later, was Walt Briggs. The next morning, there was an envelope in the mailbox. No return address. Inside $300 in 20s, and a single note card with shaky handwriting. Ruth was good to this town. Welcome home. Lucas stood at the mailbox for a long time. Copper sniffed the envelope thoroughly, then looked up. "Well, I don't know who sent it," Lucas said. He called the county that afternoon from a payphone outside the hardware store, got the water and electricity scheduled. By the end of the first week, the house was livable. Not comfortable, not warm, but livable. The water ran brown for 15 minutes, then cleared. The electricity worked in every room except the upstairs bathroom. Lucas sat at the kitchen table every evening and looked at the barn. He met Walt Briggs properly on the 8th day. He'd walked to town for supplies and stopped at the hardware store, which also sold a narrow selection of groceries, soup crackers, coffee in a big metal can. He was standing in the coffee aisle doing math in his head when someone said, "You're Lucas." Not a question. He turned around. The man from the truck. Up close, he was taller than Lucas had realized. Broad through the shoulders, though age had started to curve them slightly. Gray eyes that were sharper than his weathered face suggested. "Walt Briggs," the man said. "I live about a mile and a half past your property. Knew your grandmother. Knew your great-grandfather before that." "Did you send the money?" Lucas asked. Walt looked at him for a moment. "Henry was a good neighbor for a long time," he said, which wasn't exactly an answer. Lucas accepted it. "The house is in okay shape," Lucas said. "Better than it looked. The barn," he stopped. "What about the barn?" "I haven't gone in yet." Something shifted in Walt's expression. Small, hard to name. "What's stopping you?" Lucas thought about how to say it. "It's locked, and there's something about it." He paused. "My grandmother said Henry kept that barn private his whole life, and then she left the farm to me." He met Walt's eyes. Those two things feel connected. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come have coffee sometime. My place." "Okay." "Not sometime. Tomorrow morning." Lucas looked at him. "Okay." Walt nodded once and walked away with his box of supplies. Copper watched him go. "I like him," Copper seemed to say. "You like everyone," Lucas said. Copper didn't deny it. That afternoon, Garth's car appeared at the end of the driveway. A black Chevy Tahoe. Clean. Too clean for a gravel road. It sat at the end of the drive for a full 3 minutes before it moved up toward the house. Garth got out. He was dressed like he always dressed, like someone who wanted you to know his clothes were expensive without saying it directly. He looked around the property with the kind of look Lucas was starting to recognize, not looking at the house or the fields, looking at the land, the acreage, the boundary lines. "Lucas," he said, surprised tone, which was fake. He'd known Lucas was here. "Uncle Garth, didn't realize you'd actually come out here." He glanced at the house. "It's in rough shape." "It's better now." Garth walked toward the barn without being invited to, just drifted in that direction, hands in his pockets, like he was just wandering, like it was casual, like he wasn't deliberately walking the perimeter of something, measuring it with his eyes, calculating. Copper moved from beside Lucas and positioned himself between Garth and the barn door. Garth stopped, looked down at the dog. Copper didn't growl, didn't bark, just stood there with his tail completely still, looking up at the man with calm, steady eyes. "Nice dog," Garth said. "He is," Lucas agreed. They looked at each other across the yard. "Just checking in," Garth said, "making sure you're settled. If the taxes become a problem, the offer stands to take the property back and handle the debt through the estate." "I'll handle the taxes." "Lucas, I'll handle the taxes," he said again. Garth looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite respect. Something between them, something unresolved. Then he got back in the Tahoe, drove away. Lucas watched until the car disappeared around the bend in County Road 7. Then he looked at Copper. Copper was still watching the road. That night, after dark, Lucas sat at the kitchen table with the single lamp he'd found in the bedroom and went through the drawers methodically. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He went through the kitchen drawers first. Rubber bands, old takeout menus from a diner that had probably closed years ago, a flashlight that didn't work, 3 pens and a pencil worn to a stub, a small notebook full of grocery lists in Ruth's handwriting. He sat there for a while with the grocery list notebook. Butter, coffee the good kind, eggs, rice, cornmeal, and something for Lucas's visit. She'd written that last line, something for Lucas's visit. She'd been planning to see him again. He put the notebook down carefully, like setting down something fragile, and kept looking. The living room had a small desk in the corner he hadn't fully gone through. He'd opened the top drawer earlier, found bills and old correspondence, and set it aside for later. Now he opened the bottom drawer. It was mostly empty, but at the back, pushed flat against the wood, was an envelope, cream-colored, a little yellowed at the edges, his name on the front in Ruth's handwriting. Lucas, just that. He sat down on the dusty floor with his back against the desk. Copper came and settled beside him immediately, warm and solid. Lucas looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he opened it. The note inside was short, half a page. Written recently, the pen marks were still dark, not faded at all. "Lucas, if you're reading this, you came. I knew you would. The farm is yours. Don't let anyone tell you different. Not Garth, not anyone Garth brings with him. 2 things you need to know. First, there is a trust, a legal document, not the will Garth read at that meeting. Something older, something he doesn't know about. It protects this land in a way nothing else can. Second, find Walt Briggs. He knows things I couldn't tell you while I was alive. He's been keeping something from me for a very long time. He's been waiting for you. Trust him. There's more to this farm than anyone knows, more than Garth knows, more than I could say out loud. You'll find it." "I'm sorry I didn't have more time to explain. I thought I had more time. I love you. You were the best thing Diane ever did." Ruth Lucas read it twice, then a third time. He sat on the floor of the dark living room for a long time after that. The lamp from the kitchen threw a narrow slice of yellow light across the doorway. Copper's warmth pressed steadily against his side. A trust, Lucas thought. Something older, something Garth doesn't know about. He thought about the Tahoe in the driveway, Garth walking the perimeter of the barn, the way he'd measured the land with his eyes like it was already his. He didn't know. Garth didn't know. Whatever Ruth was protecting, whatever was on this farm that she couldn't say out loud, Garth had no idea what it was, which meant Lucas still had time. Trust Walt, she'd written. He'd already been planning to. He went to sleep with the note folded in his jacket pocket. Woke up at 2 a.m. to Copper gone from beside him. That was wrong. Copper didn't leave at night, not without waking him first. Lucas sat up, listened. From somewhere outside, faint but distinct a sound, scratching. He grabbed the flashlight and went downstairs. The back door was open, not broken open. He must not have latched it properly when he'd come in from checking the burn pile the evening before. He stepped outside into the cold October dark and swept the flashlight around the yard. Copper was at the far end of the property, by the barn, not at the door, not on the south side where the roof had collapsed, at the northeast corner of the building where the original siding met the newer repair work that Henry had done at some point when Lucas couldn't have said. The repair was older than he was, but it was different from the rest of the siding. Newer boards, different weathering pattern. Copper was digging. Not anxious digging. Not I smell a rabbit digging. Something different, deliberate, focus. He'd been at it long enough to clear a full foot of earth, the dirt piled behind him in a careful mound. Lucas crossed the yard in the dark, crouched down beside the dog. "What is it?" Copper didn't stop. 3 more pulls of his front paws. Then he sat back and looked down into the hole. Lucas brought the flashlight to the edge. Something metal, dull gray, an edge of something rectangular under the last few inches of loose soil. Lucas dug with his hands. The earth here was different from the surrounding ground, looser, like it had been turned before and then packed back down by someone who knew what they were doing. His fingers found the edges of the object. He pulled. A box. Military surplus tin, the kind made for ammunition storage. Hinged lid, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with decades of corrosion but not locked. Lucas sat back on his heels in the dark Kentucky night and held the box in both hands and did not open it immediately, because there are moments when you know, before the fact, before the evidence. You just know that whatever comes next is going to change the shape of everything that came before it. Copper pressed his nose gently against the edge of the box, then sat back, waiting. Lucas opened it. Inside a key, old-fashioned, heavy brass, the kind that hadn't been manufactured since before his mother was born. Cast iron teeth worn smooth at the tips from use. A piece of paper folded twice. A hand-drawn map of the farm, the house, the barn, the fence lines, the tree line at the back of the property, and in the northeast corner of the barn interior, where the wall met the floor, a small X marked in careful pencil. Below the X, a notation in small, precise handwriting. Northeast corner, 8 inches from wall, under the floor, and a small square of paper torn from a larger sheet. 4 numbers written in dark ink. The handwriting was Ruth's. Lucas stared at the 4 numbers in the beam of the flashlight. Copper sat beside him completely still. The barn stood 20 feet away. The rusted padlock hung on the main door, where it had been hanging since before Lucas was born. The October wind moved through the tall grass around them, and the bare branches of the tree line clicked softly in the dark. 4 numbers, a brass key, a map with an X. Lucas looked at the barn, then at the note still folded in his jacket pocket. There's more to this farm than anyone knows, and Walt Briggs 1.5 miles down the road, keeping something he'd been keeping for a very long time. He put everything carefully back in the tin box, closed the lid, stood up. "Tomorrow," he said to Copper. Copper stood up too, shook the dirt off his paws with great dignity, then trotted back toward the house like a dog who had completed an important task and was now ready for bed. They walked back into the house together. The barn stood behind them in the dark, waiting the way things wait when they've already been waiting for decades, and one more night means nothing at all. Lucas didn't sleep again until dawn, but he stopped being afraid somewhere around 3 in the morning, because fear and purpose can't occupy the same space for long, and somewhere between lying in the dark and watching the window lighten toward gray, purpose won. That was something. That was actually quite a lot. Part 2. What Henry buried and why Walt Briggs made coffee the old way. Percolator on a gas stove. No timer, no machine, just a man standing at a counter listening to the sound of water, finding its way through ground beans, knowing by the smell alone when it was ready. Lucas sat at the kitchen table and watched him do it. The house was small, clean in the way that bachelor houses get clean when the man living in them has been alone long enough to develop his own systems. Everything in its place. Tools hung on pegs by the back door in order of size. A row of seed catalogs on the windowsill, their spines faded from sun. A cast iron skillet on the stove that had probably been seasoned for 30 years. Walt set a mug in front of Lucas without asking how he took it. Lucas drank it black, because that's how it was poured, because some things you just accept. Copper had already made himself at home under the table, his chin resting on Walt's boot. Walt sat down across from him with his own mug, looked at Lucas for a long moment, the kind of looking that takes careful inventory without being rude about it. "You have Diane's eyes," he said, "but the way you hold your face still, like you're deciding what to show and what to keep, that's Henry." People keep saying that. Because it's true. Walt wrapped both hands around his mug. Henry was a man who showed you nothing he didn't intend to show you. Diane was the same way. Most people mistook it for coldness. He paused. "It wasn't." "I know," Lucas said. "Yeah." Walt looked at his coffee. "I think you do." Outside, the morning was gray and still. The fields between Walt's house and the Hale property were visible through the kitchen window. Lucas could just see the peak of the barn roof from here, just the top of it, the part that hadn't collapsed. "Ruth sent me to you," Lucas said. "I know. She left me a note, said you've been keeping something." Walt nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for this particular sentence for a long time and was taking a moment to acknowledge its arrival, to honor it almost. "She also said," Lucas stopped, put the mug down. "She said there's more to the farm than anyone knows." Walt looked at him steadily. His gray eyes didn't shift. "Did you bring the key?" he asked. Lucas pulled the tin box from his jacket and set it on the table between them. Walt looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Something moved across his face, not grief exactly, more like the weight of a very old memory finally being allowed to surface. "Henry gave me something to keep," Walt said. "The night before he went into the hospital, March of 1979. Ground was still frozen hard. He came to my door at 8 in the evening with an envelope, and he said, 'Walt, when the right person comes looking, you give them this.' He was sick by then. He knew what was coming." Walt stood up, went to the back room, came back carrying a flat envelope, the kind used for legal documents, long, cream-colored, yellowed at the edges, but intact, sealed, and unopened. He set it on the table beside the tin box. Lucas looked at it. "He said I asked him how I'd know the right person." Walt sat back down. He almost smiled. "He said they'll have the key." "And Ruth. Ruth called me the week after Henry died. Said she knew about the envelope. Said she'd lapsed the trust document through the county courthouse in 1982, 3 years after he was gone, because she wanted it done right and legal and on record where it couldn't be touched. She'd set it up the way Henry had always intended, but never gotten to the farm held in trust for Diane and her children after her. She named me as a witness on the document and asked me to keep the original copy." He paused. "I've had it for 42 years. She never told Garth. She never told anyone. That was the whole point." They drove to the farm in Walt's truck. Walt had a compressor in his barn, a proper one, the kind that powered real pneumatic tools. He loaded it into the truck bed without being asked, along with a pneumatic hammer and 2 cold chisels, a flat shovel, and a pair of work gloves. Lucas didn't ask how he knew they'd need it. Some things you just know when you've been waiting 45 years for a morning like this one. They set the compressor up outside the barn's east-facing wall and ran the air hose through the gap where the siding had warped away from the frame over decades of freeze and thaw. Lucas unlatched the main barn door with the brass key from the tin box. The padlock opened on the first try, the mechanism clicking over smooth as the day it was made, like it had been waiting. Inside the barn smelled like old hay and time, and something else underneath, something Lucas couldn't name yet, something that wasn't rot and wasn't rust and wasn't the usual smell of an abandoned place. Walt swept his flashlight across the floor. Lucas stopped. The floor was concrete, not packed earth, not wooden planks, poured concrete, smooth and consistent, stretching wall to wall across the entire barn floor, gray, unbroken. "That's not normal," Lucas said. "No." Walt agreed. It isn't. They stood there for a moment, both of them understanding at the same time what it meant. When a man pours a concrete floor in a working barn, when he does it himself, carefully in the middle of his life, and never explains why to anyone, when he keeps that barn locked for 20 years and then goes to the hospital with an envelope in his hand and a key he's leaving for someone who hasn't been born yet. You don't pour concrete like that unless you're keeping something under it. Lucas walked the floor slowly, kicking hay aside as he went. The concrete was consistent everywhere he checked. Same age, same color, same texture, except the northeast corner, where Copper had dug the night before. He crouched down, knocked with his knuckles. The sound that came back was different from everywhere else he'd knocked. Not solid, not the deep thud of thick concrete over packed clay. Hollow. He knocked again. Walt crouched beside him. There's a space under here, Walt said. Not a question. That's what the map shows. Lucas unfolded the hand-drawn paper from the tin box and laid it on the concrete. X is right here. These numbers. He handed Walt the small square of paper with the 4 digits. Walt looked at it for a long moment, then at Lucas. Let's get to work, he said. The pneumatic hammer was loud enough to rattle the old tools on their wall hooks and shake dust from the rafters above. Walt worked the northeast corner methodically. Short, controlled bursts. Concrete crumbled in chunks and pale dust. Lucas cleared the debris with the flat shovel, dragging it back toward the barn door in steady loads, working without talking, falling into the rhythm of it. They worked for 40 minutes. Then the chisel hit something different, a sound that wasn't concrete, metallic, sharp and resonant, ringing clear above the hammer's roar. Walt cut the compressor. The silence that followed was enormous, like the barn itself had been holding its breath. They both knelt in the dust. Walt brushed broken concrete away with his hands. Lucas pulled his flashlight and aimed it at the cleared area. Steel. Dull gray surface pitted with age but solid underneath, a 1/4 inch thick at least, set into a steel frame that had been bolted to a concrete foundation below the barn floor level. The frame itself was anchored deep, mortared in, immovable. A hatch, square, maybe 4 feet across, with a combination dial on a heavy latch mechanism centered on the near edge. The dial was the kind made for serious use. Thick, precise, the markings still legible after all these years. Lucas looked at the 4 numbers on the small square of Ruth's paper. He looked at the combination lock. He knelt down and dialed it. Left to the first number, right to the second, left to the third, right to the 4th. The lock clicked open. He sat back on his heels and stared at the open latch. That's what the numbers were for, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Walt put a hand briefly on his shoulder, said nothing, just helped him get the hatch open, both of them gripping the heavy steel frame, the hinges groaning from decades of disuse, protesting, then giving, swinging back and holding. Cool air rose from the opening, dry, controlled, not the damp cold of a hole in the ground, something else, the smell of something sealed and preserved and kept at a steady temperature for a very long time, something sweet underneath, something that was wood and oak and thyme. A steel ladder descended into darkness below. Lucas took the flashlight, looked at Walt. I'll go first, Walt said. No. Lucas gripped the top rung. The steel was cold through his palm. Henry was my family. Walt stepped back without argument. Lucas went down. 8 rungs, maybe 10 feet. His boots touched concrete floor. He turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness and stopped breathing. The vault ran the full length and width of the barn above it. A room dug deep into the Kentucky clay, not a hole, not a pit, but a room, planned and built, walls lined with poured concrete, smooth and solid and straight, ceiling reinforced with steel I-beams that still held true. In the far wall, a ventilation system, a pipe rising up through the earth with a hand-built mechanical damper, a masterwork of practical engineering that had kept air moving, kept temperature steady, kept humidity controlled for decades without anyone above ground knowing it existed or maintaining it. Henry had built something meant to outlast him. It had. And the shelves, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, wooden shelving units, dozens of them, built from the same careful, deliberate hand that had built the barn above. Each shelf loaded with bottles, glass bottles, dark amber glass, sealed at the neck with red wax. Hundreds per shelf, thousands in the room. Lucas walked forward like a man moving through a dream. He reached out and took a bottle from the nearest shelf. Thick glass, wax seal unbroken, a label in careful handwriting, the ink still dark after all these years, the paper still white where the wax had protected it. Hale Reserve, 1953, barrel 3, bottle 22. He held it up to the flashlight. The liquid inside was the color of dark honey, clear and deep and perfect. Whiskey. His great-grandfather had been making whiskey. Walt came down the ladder behind him, stood at the bottom rung and swept his own flashlight slowly around the room. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, almost reverently, "Good Lord." Lucas walked the shelves. The bottles were organized by year. He found 1951 at the far end and worked forward through the decades. 1952, 1953, all the way to 1968. 18 years of production, every bottle labeled, dated, numbered, every wax seal intact. He did rough math in his head. 5, maybe 6,000 bottles, maybe more. He told me he kept bees, Walt said eventually. His voice was low like they were in a church, and he was respecting the space. Whenever I asked what he did out here in the evenings, he said he was tending his bees, looking after the hives. Did you believe him? I did not believe him. Walt paused, a beat. He had honey every spring. Lucas almost laughed. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth instead. At the far end of the vault, a workbench ran the length of the wall, clean and organized, completely untouched by the decay that had claimed everything above ground. On the pegboard above it, copper tubing coiled in loops, glass instruments of various sizes, precision hydrometers in a wooden rack. On the bench surface, notebooks stacked in a careful pile, their spines labeled by year, and in the center of the bench, weighed down by a single full bottle of the darkest whiskey Lucas had yet seen, an envelope, Ruth on the front, in Henry's handwriting. Lucas stood in front of it for a moment. Then he picked it up, carried it to the ladder, and climbed up into the barn. He sat down in the rectangle of pale October light coming through the open door. Copper came immediately and settled beside him, pressing the whole length of his side against Lucas's leg. Walt stayed below, walking the shelves, slowly giving Lucas whatever privacy a barn in Kentucky could offer. Lucas broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope, pulled out the letter, 7 pages in Henry's small, careful handwriting, every line straight, every word chosen with the care of a man who knew he was writing something that would be read after he was gone. He read it. Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I owe you the truth about the years you spent not asking me questions you already knew the answers to. I started in 1949. The war was behind me, and I came home to 40 acres that wouldn't grow enough to matter, and a wife who deserved more than I had any right to offer. My father had taught me one thing before he died: how to make whiskey, clean whiskey, properly aged. It was illegal. Federal crime state, crime county crime, all of it. I knew that, and I did it anyway, because you were pregnant and the well ran dry in August, and I was 24 years old with a skill the world would pay for and nothing else to offer you. I was good at it, better than good. Word got around the way word gets around in Kentucky, careful and quiet, but faster than you'd think. Men came from Louisville, from Lexington. One man drove from Nashville 4 times in a single year. I charged what it was worth, and they paid it without argument. By 1953, I had enough money to dig. I did the digging myself, Ruth. Every shovel of clay, every bucket of dirt hauled out in the truck at night and spread in the back fields so no one would notice the displaced earth. 2 years of nights and weekends. I hired a crew from out of state to pour the concrete, men who didn't know where they were and didn't ask. I built the shelves myself. I built the ventilation system from plumbing parts and what I'd learned from my father about keeping a cellar. And when it was done, I had a room nobody knew about under a barn, nobody cared about on a farm, nobody watched closely. And then I made whiskey for 18 years. I could have sold the collection and lived rich. I chose not to, because in 1967, a man I trusted tried to take everything from me. His name doesn't matter now. He was my partner in distribution and my friend, or I believed he was. He got greedy, wanted more than his share. When I refused, he came to the farm one night with 2 other men. He intended to take the inventory and the land both. I did what I had to do to protect this family. I won't put the details in writing. You don't need them, and I don't want them to exist on paper. But that was the last night I ever ran the still. I sealed the vault. I poured new concrete over the hatch and smoothed it level with the surrounding floor. I put the key in the tin box and buried it at the northeast corner where the map would find it and nobody else would. And I never went down those stairs again. I kept the barn locked because the lock was the only thing between what I'd built and the world that would take it if it knew. A man who shows the world everything he has is already halfway to losing it. So I showed the world nothing. I drove the same truck for 20 years. I wore the same boots until they fell apart, and then I patched them. I lived on what the farm grew, and I kept this secret buried, waiting for the right moment. The right moment, Ruth, is when someone needs it more than I needed to protect it. The bottles are worth money. I don't know exactly what I'm not a businessman, never claimed to be, but I know what aged bourbon becomes with time, and these have had a great deal of time. The trust document is with Walt. He's had it since the week before I went into the hospital. You'll want to make that legal and on record after I'm gone. Walt will help you. I'm sorry for the evenings I spent in that barn instead of in the house with you. I was building something for this family. I just couldn't say what it was. I loved you every day of my life, even the days I didn't know how to show it. Henry. Lucas folded the letter, sat in the barn doorway for a long time without moving. Copper pressed close beside him, not moving either, just present, just warm. In 1967, a man I trusted tried to take everything from me. Lucas thought about Garth in the driveway, measuring the land with his eyes, making offers that sounded like concern. A man who shows the world everything he has is already halfway to losing it. He stood up, walked to the hatch, called down, "Walt." "Yeah." "The letter confirms the trust document." A pause. "I've got it." "I know." Lucas looked down into the vault, at the rows of bottles stretching into the dimness, at the shelves Henry had built with his own hands to outlast him. "Come up. We need to make some calls." Walt had a contact in Louisville. That was how he put it. A contact who happened to have 40 years in the bourbon and spirits trade, who happened to have the expertise Lucas needed, who happened to owe Walt a favor that had been outstanding since 1987. Walt made one phone call from inside the farmhouse while Lucas sat on the porch with Copper, and the October afternoon moved toward evening. The contact arrived the following afternoon in a late-model gray sedan that was considerably cleaner than anything else that had turned up County Road 7 in recent memory. His name was Desmond, 60-something, bow tie on a Tuesday, hands that moved carefully and deliberately when he handled the bottles the way hands move when they've been taught to respect what they're holding. He spent 2 full hours in the vault. Lucas and Walt waited on the porch. Lucas drank coffee that had gone lukewarm. Copper sat on the top step with focused attention on the barn door like he was personally responsible for whatever was happening inside and intended to know immediately when it was done. When Desmond came up the ladder, his face was doing something careful, the particular careful expression of someone who has seen something remarkable and is managing their response because the situation requires composure. He sat down across from Lucas at the kitchen table. "Who made this?" he asked. "My great-grandfather, Henry Hale." "Your great-grandfather," Desmond said slowly, like he was confirming something he wasn't quite ready to believe, was extraordinarily skilled. The aging process, the storage conditions, the sealing technique. I've provided consulting services to museum-quality collections with less care put into them than what's in that room. Lucas waited. "I can't give you a final number today. I need full laboratory analysis, proper provenance, documentation, authentication from my colleagues at the Tasting Institute." Desmond set his clipboard down carefully. "But based on volume, age, and condition, which is, I want to say, clearly remarkable, you're looking at a collection worth somewhere between $9 and $14 million. The number sat in the kitchen air between them. Lucas didn't move. $9 to $14 million. Henry Hale, who had driven the same truck for 20 years, who had patched his own boots, who had lived on what 40 Kentucky acres could grow and never spent a dollar he didn't have to, had been sitting on this the entire time. "If I needed to access some money now," Lucas said, "not the whole collection, just enough to handle some immediate things." Desmond nodded. "Private collectors move quickly when the provenance is sound and the product is this quality. For an initial sale, 30 bottles from the 1951 vintage, the oldest in the collection properly arranged through my office, you'd see somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 within 2 weeks, possibly faster." Lucas thought about $11,000 in back taxes, about a barn roof that wouldn't survive another winter without reinforcement, about a truck he didn't own yet, about what it cost to fight a legal battle against a man who had a Lexington attorney on retainer. "Do it," he said. Desmond looked at him, a 16-year-old in a flannel shirt sitting at a farmhouse table. "You're certain?" "Yes, and I need this kept completely quiet, nothing public, signed confidentiality agreements before anyone sees a bottle." Desmond looked at Walt. Walt nodded once, the nod of a man who had been keeping confidences for 45 years and was good at it. "Discretion," Desmond said, "is the oldest and most important part of this business." That evening, Lucas sat alone at the kitchen table with Henry's letter spread flat in front of him. He'd read it 3 times now. He kept returning to one section. Page 4, the part that wasn't about whiskey or money or the violence of that 1967 night. Diane found the hatch in 1990. She was 19. She'd come down to help me clear the barn after a late spring storm brought part of the south side roof down, and she was moving hay back from the northeast corner when she saw the concrete outline where the newer pour met the original floor. She didn't say anything at first. She just crouched down and looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me, and I told her everything. She was the only person I ever told Ruth, the only one besides you. She cried a little at first, then she got quiet, very quiet. That was always Diane's way. She'd let the feeling through fast and then get still while she thought about what it meant. She said, "I understand why you did it, and I understand why you have to keep it hidden, and I won't say a word to anyone." She never did. In 2009, when Garth started making noise about selling the property, said it was too expensive to maintain, said the land wasn't earning anything, said it made more sense to liquidate and split the proceeds, Diane was the one who stopped it. She drove down from Columbus on a Saturday, sat on this porch, and said, "We cannot sell this farm." I asked her why. She said, "Because what's underneath it belongs to this family, and I won't let it go to strangers while I'm alive to say otherwise." She didn't explain more than that. She didn't have to. And She never breathed a word to Garth about what was under the barn floor. She just stood between this land and the people who wanted to sell it, and she held that line. I don't know what would have happened to this place without her, Ruth. She was the best of us. I hope her boy knows that. Lucas pushed the letter away, stood up, walked out the back door without getting his jacket. Copper came without being called, materializing from somewhere in the house and falling into step beside him as naturally as breathing. They went to the back field, the one that sloped gently toward the tree line at the far edge of the property. Lucas sat down in the cold grass and Copper climbed into his lap, all of him, all 70 pounds, and pressed his head up under Lucas's chin. His mother had known. 19 years old, she'd found the hatch and understood what it meant and kept that secret for 30 years. And then she'd used the knowledge of what was under the barn floor to hold the line when Garth wanted to sell. She'd stood between Henry's life's work and the wrong outcome, and she'd never said a word about it to Lucas. Not once. Not even in those last months when they'd had time, and she'd known she was sick, and they'd talked about so many things. She'd kept it. To the end. I hope her boy knows that. He hadn't known. He knew now. He stayed in the field until the sky turned orange at the edges and the first stars appeared in the east. Copper didn't move, just breathed, just stayed. After a while, Copper lifted his head and looked at him with those calm golden eyes. You all right? Lucas took a slow breath. Let it out. Yeah, he said. I think I am. He wasn't entirely sure that was true yet, but it was true enough to stand on. 3 days later, the legal papers arrived. He'd seen it coming. You don't spend 10 days on a property your uncle has already mentally sold to a development company without eventually expecting the paperwork to follow. But knowing it was coming and holding the envelope in your hands at the mailbox in the cold morning air were two different things. Notice of petition for conservatorship of estate and person. He read it standing at the mailbox. Copper sat on his feet for warmth. Garth and Patrice were petitioning the county court to declare Lucas unable to manage his own affairs. They cited his age, his minor status, his sudden relocation without parental supervision to an isolated and deteriorating rural property, his apparent lack of verified income or support structure, and his vulnerability to exploitation or manipulation by unknown third parties who might be taking advantage of a grieving teenager. They were asking the court to appoint Garth as conservator, which would give Garth legal control over Lucas's personal assets, which, if they discovered what was in the vault, would give Garth control over everything. Lucas folded the papers, walked back to the house, sat at the kitchen table for exactly 4 minutes, then stood up, got his jacket, called Copper, and drove to town. Nora Ashby's law office was above the dry goods store on Calder's Main Street. Narrow staircase with a railing that wobbled, door with old frosted glass that said N, Ashby Attorney at Law, in faded gold lettering, a small waiting area that smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee. A young woman at a reception desk looked up when Lucas came in. I need to see Nora Ashby, Lucas said. Do you have an appointment? No. The young woman looked at Copper. Copper looked back. He was sitting very properly, ears forward, tail still. The posture of a dog who understood this was a professional environment. She's between appointments right now, the woman said, glancing at her calendar. Give me 1 moment. Nora Ashby was 34 years old and had been back in Calder for 18 months. She'd spent a decade at a Louisville firm before coming back to her mother's town to open a solo practice. Her desk was piled with open folders. Her coffee mug said World's Okayest Attorney in letters that were already fading. She'd bought it herself, half ironically, half not. Lucas sat across from her desk and placed the tin box on the surface between them. Then the petition papers. Then Ruth's note. Nora read the note first, then the petition. She didn't react while she was reading. No sounds, no shifts in expression, just reading with careful attention. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at him across the desk. "How old are you?" 16. "And you've been living at the Hale farm alone since October." "With my dog." Nora looked at Copper, who had settled on the floor beside Lucas's chair with his chin on his front paws. "Tell me everything," she said. So Lucas did. He told her about Ruth's letter, about Walt and the envelope Henry had left him before dying, about the vault beneath the barn floor and what was inside it, about Henry's letter and what it said about Diane, about the trust document Ruth had filed at the county courthouse in 1982 with Walt as witness that Garth apparently didn't know existed. He told her about Desmond and the preliminary valuation. He told her about Garth's visits to the farm, the way the man walked the perimeter measuring things with his eyes, the truck that had sat at the end of the driveway for 3 minutes before driving up. Nora listened without interrupting, without writing notes, just listening. When he finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The conservatorship petition," she said finally, "it's weak, structurally weak. No medical evidence, no psychiatric evaluation, no statement from any treating physician or mental health professional. They've cited your age and the fact that you relocated to a rural property. That's the entire case. Will a judge hear it? A judge is required to hear it. That's how conservatorship law works. The petition gets a hearing regardless of its merits." She leaned forward. "But the burden of proof is entirely on them, and they don't have proof. They have worry." She paused. "Here's what I need from you. The trust document from Walt. That's first, and that changes everything. Then I need documentation that you're functioning competently. School records, a statement from your doctor, any medical professional who's known you. Bank statements, receipts, anything showing you're making decisions and managing money responsibly." She stopped. "You said you already paid the back taxes." "Last week, after the first preliminary sale." Nora went still. "You sold some of the collection already." 30 bottles of the 1951 vintage. Through Desmond, it covered the taxes and the first round of repairs. And you have documentation. Every receipt. He pulled a folder from his backpack and set it on her desk. Nora opened it. Tax receipt, county stamp and date. Repair invoices with permit numbers. Truck purchase record. Bank statements showing deposits and withdrawals with corresponding receipts. Nora went through the folder carefully, page by page. When she looked up, something had shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of something she hadn't quite expected to find. "You've been documenting everything since the beginning," she said. "My mother was an accountant," Lucas said. "She kept a receipt for everything, every single purchase, every transaction, every bill, binders of them organized by month and year." He paused. "I guess it stuck." Nora closed the folder, slid it back across the desk toward him. "Lucas," she said, "I think we're going to be fine, but I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Document everything, every decision, every transaction. We're going to build a case that speaks for itself." He drove back to the farm as the afternoon light faded, parked, sat in the truck for a moment. Copper pawed at his arm from the passenger seat. "I know," Lucas said. "I'm going." He got out, went inside, and built a fire in the living room fireplace for the first time since he'd arrived, the chimney drawing well once he got it going, warmth spreading through the ground floor of the house as the evening came on. He sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the barn. He wasn't scared. That surprised him when he checked. He'd expected scared. What he felt instead was something closer to settled, like the ground under him had stopped moving. His great-grandfather had dug that room with a shovel and built it to last 100 years. His mother had found it at 19 and guarded it for 30 years without telling a soul. His grandmother had encoded the way in and waited for the right person to find it. And now he was here, which meant something. He was going to find out exactly what. That night around midnight, Copper woke him. Not a bark. a low sound in the back of his throat that meant something was wrong without making noise about it, the sound of a dog who understood that silence mattered. Lucas was up and moving before he was fully awake. He went to the window first, looked out at the yard, the barn, a light, small and moving. Inside, not possible. He'd relocked the padlock after they'd finished with the compressor. He'd checked it himself. He grabbed the flashlight, went out the back door quiet, circling wide through the tall grass, approaching the barn from the south side rather than straight across the yard. The main barn door was open, not broken open. The padlock hasp was released, the shackle hanging free. Someone who had a key, or someone who had brought bolt cutters and replaced the padlock afterward with something similar. Someone who had prepared. Lucas came around to the doorway and looked in. A figure inside, moving quickly, head down, their own flashlight, sweeping systematically across the concrete floor. They were looking for something. Copper came around the other side of the barn and barked. Once, sharp and authoritative. The figure spun. Their light hit Lucas in the face for a half second. Then they moved fast, out the door and past Lucas, and gone footsteps on gravel, fading quickly toward the road. Lucas didn't chase. He stood in the open doorway with his flashlight and looked at the floor. The hay and plywood he dragged over the hatch were undisturbed, exactly as he'd left them. Copper walked past him into the barn and went directly to the hatch and sat down on top of it. Directly on top, all 70 pounds of him planted there, with the absolute conviction of a dog who has decided this is where he needs to be and nothing is going to move him. Lucas looked at his dog. "Good boy," he said. He went back to the house and called Walt. 11:53 at night. Walt answered on the second ring like he'd been awake anyway. "Someone was in the barn," Lucas said. "Came in through the main door, had a way past the lock." "Did they get to the floor?" "No. Copper was there before they could start." A brief pause. "I've got a trail camera in my equipment shed, motion activated. I'll bring it in the morning and we'll get it set up." "Walt, who knows about the property? Who might have told Garth there's something worth finding here?" A longer pause. "Garth came by my place 2 days ago, asking questions about the farm, about Henry, about what I might remember from the old days." Lucas was quiet. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was an old man with a bad memory who kept to himself. A beat. He didn't believe me, but he couldn't prove otherwise." "No," Lucas said. "He wouldn't be able to." He hung up. Stood in the dark kitchen. Garth knew there was something. Not what it was. If he'd known what was under that floor, he'd have come with more than one person and a flashlight and a quietly picked lock. But he knew enough to send someone looking, which meant the timeline for the hearing mattered more than Lucas had realized. He sat down at the table and pulled out his notebook, started writing. Every receipt, every conversation, every date and decision put down in order from the beginning, documented from memory as precisely as he could make it, because his mother had taught him that a clear paper trail was the only thing that stood between you and the people who wanted to tell a different story about what belonged to you. He wrote until 2 a.m. Copper slept across his feet the whole time, heavy and warm. Outside, the Kentucky night was cold and still. The vault held. The bottles waited. And somewhere between Calder and Lexington, Garth Hale was doing his own calculating, his own planning, his own preparation for a hearing he believed he was going to win. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. And Lucas, 16 years old, at a kitchen table in a farmhouse his great-grandfather had built, was making sure that when the time came, the paperwork would tell the whole true story, whether anyone wanted it to or not. He had Henry's hands for this work, patient, careful, stronger than they looked. His mother had told him that when he was 12 years old, watching him repair a cabinet shelf that had come loose. "You have your great-grandfather's hands, Lucas, careful and patient and stronger than they look." He hadn't understood what she meant then. He did now. Part 3. What belongs to him? The trust document was 42 years old. Nora spread it across her desk on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the hearing and read it twice without saying a word. Then she read it a third time, slowly, looking for a crack, a flaw, anything that could be challenged. There wasn't one. Ruth Hale signing alone in 1982, 3 years after Henry had gone with Walt Briggs as the sole witness. She'd gone to a lawyer in a neighboring county, not Calder, somewhere no one would connect it to the Hale family or the farm, and she'd done it right. The farm, the land, all structures on the property, all contents within the boundary lines held in irrevocable trust for Diane Hale and her direct descendants. Irrevocable, which was a word that meant precisely what it sounded like. Cannot be revoked, cannot be amended by anyone, cannot be transferred or sold or encumbered without a court order that would require extraordinary circumstances to obtain, cannot be touched by anyone who wasn't Diane, or since Diane was gone, by anyone who wasn't the person sitting across from Nora's desk right now, right? Your grandmother filed this at the county courthouse, Nora said, not this county, Harlan County, where she knew it would sit quietly in the public record without anyone in Calder happening across it. She looked up. It's been there for 42 years. Garth's attorney ran a title search in this county and probably the next one over. They didn't go far enough. Lucas said nothing, which means either they did an incomplete search, Nora said, or they found it and made a decision not to disclose it. Still nothing. Lucas, I heard you. He had heard her. He was just sitting with the particular feeling of having suspected something and having it confirmed out loud by a professional who knew what she was talking about. It felt like something settling, like a weight finding its proper place. Copper was under Nora's desk. She'd stopped remarking on it after his third visit. He was just there now, an established feature of the office on days Lucas came in like the plant in the corner, and the oscillating fan she kept running even in November. The trust protects everything, Nora continued, the land, the barn, and here she pointed to a clause on the second page, precise language that Ruth must have spent real money on a real lawyer to get exactly right. Any personal property situated within the boundaries of the trust property at the time of the grantor's death or left there by the grantor. That's the vault. That's every bottle Henry sealed and shelved and labeled. All of it, Lucas said, every bit of it. He nodded once. And the conservatorship. Nora set the document down, folded her hands on the desk. The trust changes the landscape of the hearing entirely, even in the extremely unlikely scenario that a judge somehow granted Garth conservatorship over your personal affairs, which they won't. I want to be clear. He still couldn't touch the trust property. The trust stands independent of any guardianship arrangement. Henry and Ruth made absolutely sure of that when they structured it. She paused, but we're not going to lose the conservatorship hearing. I want you to understand that. I know, Lucas said. You don't seem worried. I'm not. Nora looked at him for a moment. In 34 years of living and 18 months of solo practice, she'd seen a lot of people in that chair. Frightened people, defeated people, people who had been ground down slowly over a long time until they'd lost track of what upright felt like. This boy looked like he'd decided something and built the rest of his posture on top of that decision. Good, she said. Then let's get everything in order. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the most purposeful of Lucas's life. Not frantic, not desperate. Purposeful the way Henry must have been purposeful when he was digging the vault by hand, one shovel of clay at a time, steady and patient, and pointed consistently in a single direction. He drove to Columbus for a full day and saw his doctor. Full physical examination, cognitive and developmental assessment. Dr. Patricia Mercer had been his physician since he was 7 years old, and she wrote a statement that was 4 detailed paragraphs and said in the measured professional language that carried weight in courtrooms that Lucas Hale was among the most functionally independent and cognitively capable adolescents she had encountered in 30 years of practice. He obtained his school records, straight A's through 10th grade, maintained without interruption, 3 letters from teachers who had worked with him over multiple years. His guidance counselor, a woman named Mrs. Hadley, who had advocated for him quietly through the difficult years after Diane died, wrote a letter that ended, "In 20 years in this role, I have rarely encountered a student who combines Lucas's level of emotional maturity, practical capability, and self-directed determination. Whatever path he chooses, he will find his way." He had no idea she felt that strongly. He filed the letter in the folder with everything else. He called Desmond. "I need to accelerate the preliminary sales," he said. "Before the hearing date, I need a documented paper trail showing the collection is being handled by a professional through proper channels with proper agreements in place." "How many bottles are we talking?" "Enough to make the documentation solid without flooding the market or drawing attention." Desmond was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking carefully about this. For 3 weeks." Another pause. 50 bottles, the 1954 and 1955 vintages. "I have 3 collectors already in conversations who would move quickly. With my preliminary authentication attached, you're looking at somewhere between 70 and 90,000. Do it. Confidentiality agreements before anything else." He used the money with deliberate care. He paid the next 2 years of property taxes in advance, the receipts stamped and filed. He hired a licensed building contractor from the county to reinforce the barn's structural roof permits, pulled properly, each inspection passed and documented. He had the farmhouse electrical system brought fully up to code by a certified electrician, the work signed off and on record. Every transaction left a paper trail. Every decision was documented before and after. "This woman knows exactly what she's doing," Henry had written about Ruth. Lucas intended for anyone who examined the record to think exactly the same thing about him. Walt came over most mornings during those 3 weeks, not to supervise, not to help with any specific task. He'd simply appear around 7 with a thermos of coffee, and they'd walk the property together while the morning was still quiet and the frost was still on the grass. Walt would tell him things as they walked, small things mostly, how Henry had rebuilt the section of fence along the eastern boundary in 1974 using a joinery technique his own father had taught him, where the creek at the back of the property ran clear year-round and where it went shallow in dry summers, what the soil composition was in the east field and what it had grown in better years and what it might grow again with attention. Lucas listened. He was good at listening. He'd always been good at it. One morning, Walt stopped at the edge of the east field and stood looking out at the bare-turned dirt. "Henry wanted to plant apple trees here," Walt said. "Always meant to, always said next year." "Why didn't he?" Walt was quiet for a long moment. The wind came through the bare oak branches along the fence line. "Because planting apple trees means you're committing to be somewhere in 10 years. You're making a promise to the future." He looked at Lucas. Henry spent a long time not being sure he had a future to commit to. Running an operation like his illegal exposed, if the wrong person talked, it makes a man careful about promises. Lucas thought about that. "He should have planted them anyway," Lucas said. "Yeah," Walt agreed quietly. "He should have." They walked back to the house without saying much more. Copper ran ahead and then back, ahead and then back, the particular motion of a dog who's happy and can't quite locate the center of that happiness, so he keeps moving toward it from different directions. Patrice called on a Wednesday afternoon 10 days before the hearing. Lucas almost didn't answer. He looked at her name on the screen through 4 rings, and his thumb hovered over the decline. But he answered. "Lucas." Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, tight, careful, like someone holding something in place with effort. Patrice, silence. I need to tell you something, she said, before the hearing. He waited. I've been going through some of Garth's correspondence. A pause. We share access to the family estate administration account. I have full access to it. Okay. There's an email thread I found. Her voice dropped slightly, not a whisper, just quieter, more careful. Between Garth and a company called Creston Development. The thread goes back 8 months. Something sharpened in Lucas's chest. He went completely still. 8 months ago, he said, Ruth was still alive. Yes. Very quiet now. She was alive, and he was already making commitments to them. The acreage, the survey maps, the projected timeline for transfer. He sent them the official survey maps, Lucas. The ones from the county assessor. He sent those before she was gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Copper looked up from his spot by the door. There's one email, Patrice said, sent 6 weeks before Ruth died. He wrote the exact words are, the property will be available for transfer following completion of estate processing. He sent that while our mother was alive. Lucas said nothing. He needed the estate to go a certain way, Patrice said. He needed his name attached to the right documents. He needed... She stopped, took a breath. He needed you not to have any legal claim to that property. I understand what he needed, Lucas said. A silence, longer than the ones before it. I knew something was wrong, Patrice said. I knew it from the meeting at his house when we sat across from you at that table. I knew it from the way he handled everything after the funeral. I knew it when he mentioned Creston Development to me months ago. Her voice was rough now. I told myself it was complicated, that family finances are always complicated, that maybe he had context I didn't have. I kept finding reasons to not say anything. He didn't have context, Lucas said. He just wanted the land. No, very quiet. He didn't have context. A long beat. Patrice, will you give the email thread to Nora? The longest silence yet. Yes, she said. That's why I'm calling. He told Walt that evening. They were on the porch with the cold coming on hard, their breath showing in small clouds. Copper was between them on the top step, pressing against both their legs, simultaneously working out his warmth distribution system with the seriousness of an engineer solving a load-bearing problem. Patrice found the emails and she's giving them to Nora, Lucas said. Walt nodded. Once, slowly. She's known something was wrong for a while, Lucas said. People who know the wrong thing and don't say it, Walt said, are usually people who are afraid of something, afraid of breaking something, afraid of what the truth costs. He was quiet for a moment. Doesn't make it right to stay quiet, but it explains the quiet. I'm not angry at her. Walt looked at him. I mean it, Lucas said. She's doing the right thing now. That has to count. Walt looked back out at the fields in the fading light. Henry would have liked you, he said. Just that. Directly. No lead-up. Lucas didn't know what to say to it, so he just said, Thanks, Walt, and they sat there until the cold drove Copper inside to find his blanket, and then a while longer after that 2 people on a porch in November watching the last of the day go out of the sky. The hearing was on a Thursday. The county courthouse in Calder was a 1-story brick building with an American flag on the pole out front and fluorescent lights inside that buzzed the particular way fluorescent lights buzz in government buildings, slightly unhappy, slightly resigned, like they've been there a long time and know they'll be there a lot longer. Lucas arrived 20 minutes early. He wore a gray button-down shirt, dark jeans, and the pair of boots that had belonged to Henry Hale and been kept in the farmhouse closet by Ruth for 45 years. They fit, barely. He'd layered an extra pair of socks. He stood outside the courthouse doors for a moment. Copper was not with him. Nora had gently suggested that a dog in a courtroom, while not explicitly prohibited by Calder County's court rules, represented a variable they didn't need. Lucas had agreed without argument. He'd left copper with Walt, which meant that for the first time since he'd arrived in Kentucky, he was walking into something alone. He straightened his collar, went in. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled walls that had been there since the building went up, 4 rows of gallery benches, a judge's bench elevated just enough to make the architectural point about authority, 1 window on the east wall admitting thin November light. Garth was already at the petitioner's table. Beside him, the attorney from Louisville, expensive dark suit, leather briefcase that looked like it had been selected to signal competence, the practiced posture of someone paid well to project certainty. Garth himself was in charcoal gray, fresh haircut. He'd been coached, and you could see it in the way he held his face. He did not look at Lucas when Lucas came in. Patrice sat in the gallery, 3rd row, by herself, not near Garth's side of the room. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in a week. She met Lucas's eyes when he walked past her row, didn't smile, just held his gaze for a moment, an acknowledgement. He nodded. She looked down at her hands. Nora was at the respondent's table with the banker's box that held everything they'd built over 3 weeks, the trust document, the tax receipts, the medical statement from Dr. Mercer, the school records and teacher letters, the contractor permits and inspection sign-offs, the electrician's certification, the bank statements, every piece of paper in order, every document organized and labeled. Lucas sat beside her. "Ready?" Nora asked quietly. "Yes," he said. And he was. He checked, and he genuinely was. He'd expected to feel something harder, fear maybe, or the sick anticipatory feeling of being in a room where other people held the decision about your life. But what he felt was clear, clean, the way the air feels after a long rain when everything has been washed and you can see farther than usual in every direction. He placed both hands flat on the table and waited. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, silver hair cut short, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She entered without ceremony and sat and opened the file and read in complete silence for 2 full minutes while the room held still. Then she looked up. "Petitioner's counsel, this court has before it a petition for conservatorship of a minor. What is the basis for this petition?" Garth's attorney stood. He had a voice designed for rooms like this one, measured, authoritative, carrying easily to the back wall. "Your Honor, the respondent is a 16-year-old minor who, in the aftermath of his grandmother's death, abandoned his established residence in Ohio and relocated without adult supervision to a deteriorating rural property in this county. He has no legal guardian present, no verified source of income, and has engaged in significant financial activity whose origin his family cannot account for. We have a reasonable and well-founded concern that he is being exploited by unknown parties who may be taking advantage of a vulnerable and grieving teenager." The judge looked at Lucas directly. "How old are you?" 16, Your Honor. "And you've been living at the Hale Farm on County Road?" 7 since October of this year." "Yes, ma'am." "Alone, with my dog, Your Honor." Something moved in the judge's expression, very small, very carefully controlled. "Respondent's counsel," she said. Nora stood. She didn't perform. She didn't employ the practiced confidence of someone paid to project certainty. She simply laid it out piece by piece the way you build a structure that needs to hold weight. The trust document first, signed by Ruth Hale in 1982 at a county courthouse outside this jurisdiction with Walt Briggs as witness, on file in the public record for 42 years, establishing the farm, the land, and all contents therein as held in irrevocable trust for Diane Hale and her direct descendants, with Lucas as the sole surviving direct descendant. The medical statement from Dr. Patricia Mercer, 4 paragraphs. Professional language that translated to this young man is cognitively sound, emotionally capable, and fully competent to make his own decisions. The school records, the teacher letters, the guidance counselor's statement, Then the financial documentation. The tax receipts paid in full plus 2 years in advance. The contractor invoice for the barn roof with permit numbers and inspection certifications attached. The electrician's certification on the farmhouse electrical system. The bank statements showing deposits, expenditures, and a consistent positive balance. The respondent, Nora said, has resolved $11,000 in outstanding property taxes. He has brought the farmhouse electrical system into full compliance with county code. He has reinforced the structural integrity of the main barn with properly permitted and inspected work. He has purchased a vehicle, opened and maintained a bank account in good standing, and enrolled in a county-approved online education program through which he continues to maintain his academic record. She paused to let that settle. Every single transaction is documented. Every decision has a paper trail. The petitioner has offered no medical testimony, no psychiatric evaluation, no statement from any treating professional of any kind. They have offered the respondent's age and the fact of his relocation to a rural property he legally owns. Another pause. That is not a conservatorship case. That is a 16-year-old managing an inherited estate more carefully and competently than most adults manage their own affairs. Garth's attorney tried. The source of the respondent's funds remains unexplained, Your Honor. He arrived in Kentucky with minimal resources, and the financial activity since then is inconsistent with any legitimate explanation available to the petitioners. The source of the funds is the trust property, Nora said, even and clear. The respondent discovered assets on the farm left by his great-grandfather, which he has been liquidating through documented, legitimate channels with the assistance of a credentialed professional. The trust document explicitly states that all property and contents within the trust boundaries belong to the beneficiary. Those assets are legally his. The sales are legal. The proceeds are his. Every transaction is on file. The judge removed her glasses. She looked at Garth. When a judge removes her glasses and looks at you directly across a courtroom, something is about to be said that she wants you to receive without any buffer between you and the words. Mr. Hale, she said, does the petitioner have medical testimony, a physician's statement, any evidence of any kind beyond your personal concerns about your nephew's living situation? Garth looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table in front of him. No, Your Honor, Garth said. Not at this time. The judge was quiet for a measured moment. I'm dismissing this petition, she said. She looked at both sides of the room with the same steady attention. I'll note for the record that petitioning for conservatorship of a minor without any medical basis or professional evaluation is not a neutral act. It causes real harm to the respondent. It consumes this court's time, and it raises questions about the petitioner's motivations that I will leave to other proceedings to examine. She picked up her gavel. The trust is confirmed and on record in this jurisdiction. The respondent's ownership of the property and all contents therein is upheld. This matter is closed. The gavel came down. Garth caught up with him in the hallway. Of course he did. Lucas had been expecting it since he'd walked through the courthouse doors that morning. The formal proceeding was one thing. The hallway was where the actual conversation happened, where the real things got said outside the record. Lucas. Garth's voice was under control, just barely. Lucas stopped, turned. They stood in the courthouse hallway in the November light from the windows. Garth in his expensive charcoal suit, Lucas in Henry's boots. What is on that property? Garth said. Not a question, a demand dressed as one. My family's history. That is not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get. Garth stepped closer, not threatening, just using his size the way men who are used to being the largest presence in a room instinctively use it. I'm your family. I'm your uncle. I've been trying to look out for your... You signed a letter of intent with Creston Development 6 weeks before Ruth died. Lucas said. Garth went still, completely still. You promised them the property, the acreage, the survey maps, the transfer timeline, while she was still alive in that house. Lucas looked at him steadily. Whatever story you've been telling yourself about what you were doing, that's what you actually did. Silence in the hallway. I'll come back, Garth said, quieter now. A different register. Careful. I'll find a physician who can make the appropriate assessment. You'll spend a significant amount of money, Lucas said, and you'll lose. He turned, walked toward the exit. You're a child, Garth said behind him. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Lucas didn't stop, didn't look back, because here's what happens when a man who has just lost in court calls you a child. It doesn't land the way he intends it to. It just sounds like what it actually is, a man who has run out of substantive arguments, reaching for the one thing he still thinks might sting. It didn't sting. Lucas pushed through the courthouse doors into the cold November air. Patrice was in the parking lot, leaning against her car with her arms folded across herself. Not against the cold, against something internal, like she was holding the pieces of something together through pressure alone. She looked up when Lucas came out. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other across the parking lot. Thank you, Lucas said, for the emails. I should have done something sooner. Her voice was uneven. I've spent weeks building stories in my head about why it was complicated, about how family is complicated, about how Garth maybe had reasons I didn't understand. She shook her head. It wasn't complicated. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong from the moment he mentioned Creston to me, and I said nothing for months. But you said something before the hearing. She looked at him. Is that enough? Lucas considered the question honestly. He thought about what it meant to do the right thing late. Whether late canceled out the doing or just complicated it. It was enough for today, he said. That's where we are. Not absolution, not the full weight of forgiveness yet, but not a closed door either. Just the honest truth of where they were standing, which was a start. Patrice looked at the pavement, then back up at him. He's going to try again. You know that. He's going to find a doctor and try again. Let him try. She almost smiled, the edge of one. You sound like Ruth. Good, Lucas said. She usually won. He got in his truck and drove back to the farm. Walt was on the porch when he pulled up, coffee thermos on the railing beside him, Copper next to his feet. Lucas parked and got out, and Copper came off the porch in a single fluid leap and covered the distance between them in about 2 seconds. Front paws, landing on Lucas's shoulders, face directly in his face tail, moving like something with its own weather system. Okay, Lucas said. Okay, yes. Hi, I know. I missed you too. Hi. Copper dropped down, spun once, looked up. Well, how did it go? We won, Lucas told him. Copper spun again faster and then tore off across the yard in a wide loop for no reason except that the news was good and the field was there, and running in a wide loop was the appropriate response. Walt watched from the porch with the expression of a man who had known how it was going to go and was satisfied to have been right. Come have coffee, he said. They sat on the porch as the afternoon light began to leave the sky. November pale blue overhead, clear and cold, and going on forever. He'll try again, Lucas said. Probably. With a doctor this time. Maybe. You don't look worried. Walt looked out at the fields, at the barn with its new roof structure solid against the sky. A trust that's been sitting in the county record for 42 years isn't something a hired physician undoes, he said. Garth knows that now. He'll make noise because men like Garth always make noise after they lose, but noise is just noise. Lucas thought about the email thread, the correspondence with Creston Development, the promises made about land while the woman who owned it was still breathing. He's going to face more than a conservatorship case, Lucas said. Yeah, Walt agreed. He is. A beat of quiet. Patrice is going to need someone, Walt said, when it gets hard, when she's dealing with the consequences of what she did and what she didn't do. She's going to need someone to talk to who isn't Garth. I know. You gonna be that person. Lucas thought about Patrice in the parking lot, holding herself together, about what it costs to do the right thing when you've waited too long to do it, about what a person needs when they're living with that. When she's ready, he said. Yeah. Walt nodded. They were quiet. The field stretched out pale in the fading light. The barn at the far end of the property, solid now. The farmhouse behind them carrying the smell of wood smoke through the walls from the fire Lucas had learned to build properly. Henry told me something once, Walt said eventually. The last winter, before he went into the hospital, we were sitting just about where we are now. Different chairs, but the same porch, he said. Walt paused for a moment, making sure he had it right. He said the things you build with your hands outlast everything else. What you build with money, with words, with deals and agreements, all of that falls apart when the conditions change. But what you build with your time and your patience and your hands, that stays. Lucas looked at the barn, at the fence line Walt had helped him rebuild, at the house that had been mold and dust and broken windows when he arrived and was now warm and tight and lived in. He was right, Lucas said, usually was. Walt stood up carefully, the cold porch having made his knees express their opinion. I'm going to head back before dark. He went down the steps, stopped at the bottom without turning around. Your mother was right about your hands, he said. Henry's hands, they're good ones to have been given. He walked to his truck, drove away down County Road 7. Lucas sat alone on the porch and watched the last light leave the sky. He went to the barn that evening, not to count inventory, not to check the hatch. He knew what was there. He'd been down the ladder enough times that the layout was mapped in his memory, every shelf familiar, every label readable in his mind without a flashlight. He went because there are places you need to return to in order to fully understand what they mean to you. He opened the hatch, climbed down, stood in the vault with the flashlight off for a moment in the complete dark, just listening to the ventilation system hum its patient mechanical breath. Then he turned on the light. The bottles were where they'd always been. Every one of them, each sealed, each labeled, each one representing an evening Henry Hale had spent in this room instead of somewhere else. Building something he couldn't explain to the people he loved. Protecting something he couldn't name without putting them in danger of knowing it. Lucas walked to the workbench. On the surface, exactly where Henry had left it, under a single full bottle, was the empty envelope addressed to Ruth. Lucas had unfolded it carefully after reading the letter and returned it to its place. It seemed right to leave it there. He looked at it for a while. I was building something Henry had written. I just couldn't say what. His great-grandfather had been afraid his whole life that what he'd built would be taken from him, so he'd buried it, sealed it, poured concrete over it, and lived simply and kept quiet and trusted exactly as many people as he absolutely had to. It had worked, and it had cost him. Every evening in this room instead of upstairs in the house, every conversation cut short or turned aside, every question from Ruth or Diane answered with something that wasn't quite a lie, but wasn't the truth either. The distance between himself and the people he loved maintained carefully because he believed, and maybe he was right, that closeness was risk, and risk was the thing that ended everything. He hadn't been a cold man. He'd been a frightened one. Lucas picked up the empty envelope, turned it over in his hands, set it back down exactly where Henry had left it. He climbed the ladder, closed the hatch, covered it, walked out into the November night. December came slowly to the farm. Lucas worked, not frantically, not anxiously, the way Henry had worked steadily, one thing at a time done right, leaving a record building something meant to last. He enrolled in the online education program through the county. Mrs. Hadley, from his school in Columbus, helped set it up, putting in more effort than her job description required, because that was apparently the kind of person she'd always been. He kept his grades exactly where they'd always been, high. He worked with Desmond on the collection in careful stages, small batches, private collectors who signed confidentiality agreements before they were told anything. The income was steady and properly documented and went through the bank account, nor reviewed on a quarterly basis. By mid-December, he had enough set aside to order the saplings. 12 apple trees from a nursery in Lexington. They'd arrive in March root-wrapped and dormant. He'd plant them himself one at a time in the rows Henry had always meant to plant in the east field, in the soil that had been waiting. 10 years before they bore fruit in any real quantity. He intended to be standing in that field when they did. Patrice called in mid-December on a cold, clear afternoon when Lucas was splitting firewood behind the house. The investigation formally opened, she said. Creston Development's legal team contacted the county prosecutor's office. They're cooperating fully. Apparently, they have very strong feelings about not being implicated in estate fraud. What does that mean for Garth? His attorney is already in negotiation conversations. A pause. The emails are central to everything. Lucas set the splitting maul down. Are you okay? He asked. I think so. She was quiet for a moment. It's strange. I thought I'd feel worse about it. About Garth. We're not close, but he's my brother. Another pause. But mostly what I feel is tired. Tired of having known and said nothing. Tired of the story I told myself about why it was complicated. A breath. You asked me once if it was enough what I did before the hearing. I've been thinking about that. And I think it was enough to start over from, she said. That's what I've decided. Lucas looked out at the east field. Come in the spring, he said, when the trees go in. I'd like that, Patrice said. I'd really like that. January on the farm was the quietest Lucas had ever experienced. Not the absence of sound. The creek at the back of the property ran clear and cold year-round, steady over the stones. Wind moved through the oak branches along the fence line. Deer moved through the fields at dawn. Once, a pair of wild turkeys crossed the yard at close range, which Copper observed with intense interest and admirable restraint, but under all of it, a stillness, the particular stillness of a place that has settled into itself, that knows what it is. Lucas woke before dawn most mornings now, sat at the kitchen table with coffee while the light changed, looking out at the barn, the way Henry must have looked at it from this same window, this same angle for 20 years. He'd been reading Henry's technical notebooks from the vault workbench, the ones stacked and labeled by year. Henry's observations about the aging process, about how different barrel chars affected flavor over time, about temperature variations and their effects on the spirit through seasons and years. Precise, careful observations written in the same small hand as the bottle labels. Henry had been a scientist without calling himself one, a craftsman and a researcher, and a man who paid close attention to everything, who learned from what he observed, who let evidence change his methods. Lucas was learning from him. One Thursday morning in late January, Copper woke him before dawn with a paw on his shoulder and an air of having decided it was time. Lucas got up, made coffee, pulled on his jacket and boots. They went out to the barn together, in the dark, Copper moving ahead on the frost-hard ground with his breath making small clouds. Lucas unlocked the barn, opened the hatch, went down. He stood at the bottom of the ladder for a moment, just stood there in the quiet of the vault, the ventilation humming, the flashlight off, the complete dark. Then he turned on the light and walked to the far end of the shelves, to the 1951 section, barrel 1, bottle 1, the first bottle Henry had labeled and sealed, or the first one he'd kept, the beginning of the beginning. It had been sitting in this room since before Diane was born, since before Ruth had any gray in her hair, since before Lucas's entire existence was even imaginable. 73 years. He held it up to the flashlight. The liquid inside was the color of dark amber at the edges, nearly black at the center, where the light didn't reach, perfectly clear, perfectly preserved. He held it for a long time, then he put it back on the shelf, exactly where it had been, exactly where Henry had placed it. He climbed the ladder, closed the hatch, walked out of the barn into the January morning, the sky just starting to go gray at the east horizon, Copper waiting for him in the frost. They went to the east field. Copper ran his morning loops wide circles, ears back pure acceleration, for no reason except the field was there, and his legs worked and the cold air carried good smells, and being alive was a sufficient reason on its own. Lucas stood at the edge of the field and watched him. The farm stretched out in every direction from where he stood, the farmhouse behind him with its fresh white paint catching the early light, the fence line running straight along County Road, 7 rebuilt board by board, the barn with its solid new roof against the pale sky, the fields bare but ready, the soil waiting for what came next. His great-grandfather had built something here and spent his whole life afraid it would be taken. His grandmother had protected it for decades without telling anyone except the one person she trusted completely. His mother had stood between this land and the wrong outcome, had held the line in 2009 when Garth wanted to sell, had carried the secret of what was under the barn floor for 30 years without saying a word, not to protect herself, but to protect it for whoever came after her. And now Lucas was standing on it, not because he'd been lucky, not because he'd been clever in any way that mattered independently, because they had trusted him with it. 3 generations of careful, quiet, patient people who had each carried part of this forward in the dark without knowing exactly who would receive it at the end. And he intended to be worth that trust. Every day, every decision, every careful transaction documented, and every fence board replaced, and every bottle sold through proper channels, and every receipt filed in the folder. He intended to plant the apple trees in the spring, and tend them through the summers, and be standing in that field when they bore fruit. Copper looped back and came to a stop in front of him, tongue-out eyes, bright with morning. "Well," his whole body said, "what are we doing today?" Lucas looked at the east field, at the rows of bare dark soil where the saplings would go in March, at the space between the trees that didn't exist yet, at the 10 years of patience it took to make something from a sapling and a patch of prepared ground. He looked at the barn behind him, at the house, at the fence Walt had helped him build against the January cold. He looked at Copper. "Let's go to town," he said. "I need to pick up some things." Copper spun once, then twice, then took off toward the truck at a full run, ears flat, all 4 feet, leaving the ground, covering the distance in seconds, like the decision had obviously been made a long time ago, and he had simply been waiting for the human to say it out loud. Lucas followed him across the frozen grass. The farm stood behind him in the winter light, still, patient, breathing slow, waiting for spring, the way Kentucky always waits, knowing that the cold is not permanent, that the ground will soften, that what has been protected and tended and kept through the hard months will eventually, in the right season, become exactly what it was always meant to be. He was home. He had always been home. He just needed to find his way back to it.